Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmin, and today I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Rubio from Toronto Metropolitan University to make a tier list of arguments for and against God's existence. So I'm very excited about this. Thanks, Daniel, for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Where should we start? We're going to start with our arguments for theism.
Yeah.
And maybe, what do you think? What arguments should we start with?
Let's start with cosmological arguments.
Okay, let's start with cosmological arguments. And actually, old reliable. Let's do the old Kalam. So what's this distinction between the old Kalam and the new Kalam? And what's the argument?
So Kalam kind of comes from Arabic. The Kalam cosmological argument was sort of the traditional Muslim argument for the existence of God. You go read classic Muslim philosophy or find different versions of it. They tend to be very Neoplatonic because the Islamic philosophy in the Islamic Golden Age heavily influenced by Plotinus and the Greeks. In the contemporary literature, there are sort of two versions of it. The one version that's sort of associated with William Lane Craig, and it roughly goes like this. Anything that begins to exist has a cause of it beginning to exist. The universe began to exist, so there's a cause for the universe beginning to exist. Now, you've still got a bunch of work to do to get all the way to theism from there, but it's a boost, it's a leg up that you can go read a bunch of scholastics that once they got to a big cause from the beginning of the universe, insert some magic metaphysics and you get God at the end. Craig kind of defends it in two ways. So he thinks the first premise, anything that begins to exist has a causal interest, that's super plausible. It doesn't ton of work done to defend that, but his opponents were also tended to be happy to grant him that one. The second premise is where all the action is, that the universe begins to have an existence. He sort of argued for this in two ways. One way, like out right now, is really bad. His infinity hater arguments. And then the other way, kind of from contemporary physics, that's more plausible. Where this argument would go, I'd put it. So, sort of three things we want to consider when you consider how good is an argument for the existence of God. One is just like how much rational pressure does it exert on the non-theist to become a theist. And you primarily evaluate the, is the argument well-structured? Are the premises plausible? To the extent that those things are true, it puts pressure. And to the extent that there are points of rational resistance, it doesn't put pressure. Then there's a psychological question, like how persuasive is this argument? So assuming you knew someone reasonably well and were really trying to convert them, would this be a good argument to use, generally speaking, or a bad argument to use, generally speaking? But then there's this third dimension that probably we philosophers are the most interested in, which is like how interesting are the issues that this argument raises? Does it unearth a bunch of cool new philosophical questions? Or is it just kind of show up, unbox your standard assumptions, and decide what you think? This argument, I think there are ways to resist. Like you go look at the physics, whether you need a beginning of the universe or not, highly controversial. You look at the infinity hater arguments, the infinity hater arguments are mostly no good. So I'd say it doesn't put a lot of rational pressure. Is it persuasive? Like in some contexts, it is pretty persuasive. Any number of people have been either like kind of reconfirmed in that theism or brought around to theism by the thought that the universe needs a cause and that God's a pretty good candidate for that cause. Does it bring up a bunch of interesting philosophical questions? It's like middle of the road. Like some of the paradoxes of infinity themselves are intrinsically very interesting. The ones that Craig tended to use that this tend to be associated with this argument less interesting,
Right.
than some of the other ones that we'll talk about.
Hilbert's Hotel, all those sorts of things.
Wait. So I'm going to give this one a C.
Okay, C. Awesome. So we got the first ranking from Daniel. The old Kalam, that's sort of what we're talking about. Kalam cosmological argument as defended by William Lane Craig, appealing to these more old school paradoxes of infinity, like Hilbert's Hotel, those sorts of things. Yeah, what would I give this? C. I'm thinking maybe D plus, C minus.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, for the audience, we got a lot of arguments to go through, and you guys already know what I think about many of these arguments. This is kind of just introduce you guys to Daniel. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to put links to Daniel's website and other work in the description. You guys should definitely check it out. Lots of really cool stuff in there. So definitely check out the description, all of Daniel's work. But you guys already know what I think about most of these arguments. I've done like many videos and many hours of content on these arguments. So I'm going to try to platform Daniel here and mainly have him give his thoughts. So roughly speaking, I agree with that. But let's go on to the new Kalam. So the new Kalam really kind of blossomed out of the work of Alexander Cruz, Rob Thoones, a few others, crucially reliant on various, maybe more recent, more interesting paradoxes in infinity, having to do with Bernard-Eddy paradoxes, the Grim Reaper paradox, all those sorts of things, and also having to do with kind of decision theoretic paradoxes, more probabilistic stuff, infinite fair lotteries, etc. So I'll turn it over to you maybe to explain a little bit more about some of this stuff and your take on it.
Yeah, so ground zero for this is Alex Cruz's book, Causation, Infinity, and Paradox.
The infinite causation paradox.
Infinite causation and paradox, yeah. And he's got a couple of things going on in the book. Like, one, he just does a really nice job of laying out the paradoxes of infinity as sort of a contemporary philosopher should be worried about. And he does this thing where he like gives the informal version and then he does the mathy version. Like, for those who don't know, Cruz has got both a philosophy PhD and a math PhD and is well published both in philosophy and mathematics. So like he can do the formal stuff all day and all night if he wants to. But his qualitative explanations are pretty good. So he's got metaphysical paradoxes, and then maybe the prime example of this is the Grim Reaper, or in the book is Grim Lamplighter.
Yeah.
You've got these reapers, and here's how a reaper works. You give it a target and a time. And if the target delight at the time, it kills them. If the target's dead at the time, it does nothing. So then you set up this sequence of Grim Reapers. Say we want to get rid of today.
Let's get rid of Philip Swenson.
Okay, so we want to get rid of Philip Swenson. So we set up our Grim Reapers. We say, all right, Grim Reaper 1, if at 2 o'clock Philip Swenson is alive, he's gone. So then, okay, we don't want to wait till 2. That's a little while. So let's have the times 2. And in set at halfway between now and 2, let's pretend it's 1. At 1:30, if Philip Swenson is alive, he's gone. Yeah, but we're a little impatient still. So let's let's have it again. So the next one is done at 1:15 and so on and so on. They sort of asymptotically approach 1 o'clock. So time turns and question, does Philip die? Well, if Reaper N was gonna kill him, then he's already been dead because Reaper N plus 1 would have killed him earlier. But this is true for all the Reapers. So on the one hand, we got a great argument that Philip survives. There's no Reaper that kills him. On the other hand, we got a great argument that Philip dies. There are Reapers, infinitely many of them, set between now and 2 to kill him if he's still alive. So how could he be alive at 2? There are other paradoxes, but that's sort of the flavor of the new. This is the Bernard-Eddy paradox. And it's one of the big motivators. And Peirce wants to say what this proves, or the best way to address all these paradoxes, is to say there cannot be an effect with infinitely many causal inputs. This is his causal finitism. It's an improvement on like the pure infinity hater finitism, because other kinds of infinity are fine. So like this isn't going to wipe out most of mathematics the way that the old school infinity haters wanted to do. This is still going to let you hire an infinitely large multiverse as long as the worlds only interact in finite sizes and things like that. So it has, especially if you're an infinity fan, which like as Hard Cruise is, it has advantages over the way the old school Kalam defenders work. That being said, it's still pretty, takes out a lot. And we can maybe talk about this later. It may not totally solve this style of problem.
Right. No, I'll elaborate on that a little bit. So, as my wonderful listeners know, I've done a lot of work on these sorts of paradoxes. One sort of criticism of these paradoxes is that they don't actually show that causal finitism is true, or the culprit in these scenarios is infinite causal chains. Instead, all they tell us is that the whole story is impossible. The whole story is inconsistent. You can tell inconsistent stories involving taxis, but we shouldn't infer that taxis are impossible. We should just infer that the whole story is impossible. And similarly, what I argue with Alex Malpass in a forthcoming Mind article is that likewise, we should think with these paradoxes that it's really the whole story which is impossible, not any particular element of the story like infinite causal chains or things like that. And actually, you can get Bernard-Eddy paradoxes, exactly similar paradoxes that causal finitism cannot solve. So we can kind of formalize, we can give a kind of formal rendition of the paradox that you gave, where each Reaper kills Fred, or not Fred in this case, Philip Swenson. Each Reaper kills Philip if and only if no previous Reaper kills Philip, and there's a kind of beginningless chain of those Reapers that spread out in time. Now, that's a purely formal setup, and that those two conditions are jointly inconsistent. But we can't infer solely from that joint inconsistency that you can't have beginningless chains of items or even beginningless chains of items that are causally connected up. You need some further premise to get that. And actually, if you want to solve all the relevant kinds of Bernardini paradoxes, you can't just adopt causal finitism, because we can just suppose that each reaper is just a brute fact about each reaper, that they kill Fred if and only, or kill Philip if and only if none of the previous reapers killed Philip. Or maybe they're non-causally sensitive to and explained by the previous members in the sequence. So in order to solve these, Bruce would have to add some additional auxiliary assumptions like, oh, well, there can't be that kind of those sorts of brute facts. Oh, there can't be infinite chains of non-causal dependence. And then you're starting to get this monstrously profligate, disjunctive kind of solution, which is, in my view, obviously not getting to the heart of the matter. And that's where I think the kind of unsatisfiable paradiagnosis, just saying that's the whole story that's impossible, end of story, I think that's really what's getting to the heart of these things.
In a way, the two solutions kind of converge, because as Proust's solution gets more disunified and more disjunctive, it looks an awful more like, yeah, you just told an impossible story there, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly. So, but that's the kind of more concrete causal versions of the paradoxes. There are also these decision theoretic paradoxes. So, you want to say something about those?
Yeah. So, for my money, the decision theoretic paradoxes are actually the more interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one is that you can't invoke some metaphysics to get out of them. And number two, that they're mind-bending in a way that some of the other ones aren't. So here's one of the ones that always to me. Fact number one: if you have of an infinite lottery, and actually to make life a little easier, let's say it's an uncountable lottery, you can model it as fair if you've got infinitesimals. This is just something that you prove in non-standard analysis.
What is a fair lottery for the audience?
A fair lottery is where exactly one ticket will win, and every ticket has an equal chance of winning.
Okay.
Now, you can improve everybody's odds and yet bias the lottery by just moving from infinitesimals to a geometric series like 1/2, 1/4, 1/8. So you assign each ticket one of these. And suddenly, like, everybody's probability of winning goes up, and the lottery is no longer the lottery is no longer fair. That to me is just like, what on earth is going on? Like, the concept of quantity here is breaking down, which is one of the things infinity does. Unfortunately, I don't think by saying you can't solve this problem. I think just by saying that lottery is impossible. Like, think of other difficult paradoxes, like the St. Petersburg game. For those who don't know, the St. Petersburg game is this game. I'm going to start flipping a coin. If it lands heads, I'll flip it again. When it lands tails, the game terminates. You get paid 2 to the n, where n is the flip where the game terminates. What's the fair price for this game? Well, if you take the expected utility of the game, which is sort of the standard way of figuring out fair prices, the fair price is greater than any finite number. So you should be able to willing to give me everything you own, everything your children own, everything their children's going to own, so on for the next 1,000.
And that's because you have a 1/2 chance of getting $2.
Yep.
You have a 1/4 chance of getting $4. You have a 1/8 chance of getting $8, 1/16 chance of getting $16. And that's just the way that heads coins work out. You know, like tails, heads, heads. I mean, depending on where it's heads, tails. But, and then when you multiply those and add a cross, as it were, with your decision theory table or whatever, you get 1/2 times $2, that's just $1. 1/4 times $4, that's $1. So $1, that's $1. And then you keep on adding, it's just infinity.
Exactly. That's where you get it. So one response people have had to this paradox is to say, yeah, well, anyone who offers this to you is a liar because they don't have an infinite bank. That's like the wrong way to solve the paradox. Nobody was concerned that you would actually go to St. Petersburg, that some city Russians are here down to flip a coin for you. Give me everything you got. That wasn't the problem we were worried about. We were worried about what our math did in this non-standard situation. And we should be just as worried about that if the non-standard situation is impossible, as long as we can still reason coherently about it.
You know, even if it's not possible, if there were such a scenario, what would be the rational response?
Right.
Would you be committed to giving up all of your wealth in order to just play this stupid game that you would like win $4 at?
Exactly. Like, most of the time what's going to happen is they'll terminate 1, 2, 3, 4 flips if you're lucky.
Yeah, right. So let's turn this back. How does this relate to these decision theoretic infinity paradoxes? Because you're developing a criticism of Proust's inference to causal finitism. So how does this work as a criticism of Proust?
So I think Proust is right that the paradoxes are puzzling, but I think Proust is wrong that causal finitism can solve the puzzle. Because even if they're impossible, like accept causal infinitism and say, yeah, none of those situations could arise, they'd still be puzzling because there's still the counterfactual. Well, what would be the right way to reason if we were to encounter that scenario?
Yeah.
Just like, accept essence of origins. I couldn't have had different parents, but still I might ask how my child had gone if I had different parents.
Right, exactly. And just as, like, maybe even it's impossible to have just the way that economy works. You just can't have infinite money or something like that. Just doesn't make sense. Or the way that people are essentially constituted or economies are constituted. You can't have infinite money. Still, like, no one would take it seriously to say, oh, stop worrying about the Psychophysical paradox because you just can't have infinite money.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not, you're missing the problem. The problem is if there were such a thing, what would be the right rational response? And our best kind of formal tools seem to indicate that, oh my goodness, like it's a crazy response. And that's where the paradox lies. And saying that infinite money is impossible doesn't solve that paradoxical aspect. And it's the same thing.
Perfectly serviceable theory of rationality just kind of goes bonkers on these assumptions.
Right.
And it does that whether or not the assumptions are possible.
Okay, so let's rank the new Kalam.
I'm going to give the new Kalam a B. So again, I think it's not especially persuasive. I think it raises much more philosophically interesting problems than the old Kalam. I think that there are, we just explained how you could rationally resist it. So I think a B's the right grade here.
And that's fair. I'd probably go maybe B minus, C plus, B minus probably. But I think that's fair. Okay, that's the Kalam. Now let's get on to contingency arguments. So what are contingency arguments and how would you rate them?
So contingency arguments go way, way, way back. You start looking at early arguments for the existence of God. You find versions of this in Aristotle. Aquinas is probably the best non-author associated with contingency arguments. The Leibniz-Clark correspondence, that's probably like the classic version of a contingency. And the thought is this. We have contingent things, and we need an explanation of where the contingent things came from.
And contingent things here is just things which can fail to exist. The modal notion. It's not explanatory. We're not saying there are dependent things. We're saying there are things that can fail to exist. They don't have to be a reality.
And then the thought is, well, you couldn't explain all of the contingent things with a contingent thing, because then it would be one of the contingent things and it would have to explain itself. So if you can't explain the contingent things with a contingent thing, what kind of thing could you explain them with? Well, maybe a necessary thing. So from contingent things and sort of the metaphysical principles of that explanation, and you have to get a little bit into the details to rule out things like infinite backward chains and stuff like that. Even for a necessary being, and again, you're sort of a hop, skip, and a jump.
Yeah. Okay. So, many ways, your biggest worries for this argument.
So again, you've got to go in for some of these affinity hater moves in order to make the argument work. Because, like, here's a natural thought. Like, how do you get the coffee cup from the plastic? How do you get the plastic from the oil in the ground? How do you get the oil in the ground from the biological matter that died? And now just keep giving an explanation in terms of another contingent thing, all the way back to infinity. Let's say we're in an inflationary cosmos or something like that. There doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that explanation. It doesn't seem like I left anything out. There's nothing needed that we still need to explain. At which point it looks like this principle that just says, if you've got contingent things, you can't explain them using entirely contingent things. That just looks like it's got plausible counterexamples.
What do you think about Leibniz's geometry book case? So, like, I think it's Euclid's Elements or something like that, where it's copied from a previous Euclid's Elements, which is copied from a previous Euclid's Elements, which is copied from a previous Euclid's Elements, and so on ad infinitum. Sure, each member of the chain has an explanation, but still seems like there's something missing. Like, why are they Euclid's Elements as opposed to Principia Mathematica? Or, like, why are there any copies at all? Like, why was there any copying going on in the first place?
Yeah, so you can give particular infinite backwards chains that aren't satisfactory. And like, I got this book by copying a different copy of the book. We haven't answered where the book came from. But notice there's nothing infinity-ish involved there. So like, take another version of an information paradox, the one that invokes time travel. Let's say Joe here is a big classical music fan. And somebody's like, the only reason Beethoven was able to compose the Ninth Symphony is because he had some help. He was deaf when it happened, so he couldn't compose it on his own. And this little fact just like bothers Joe. And meanwhile, kind of as a side project, Joe makes a time machine. And then he's like, I really want to make sure the Ninth Symphony makes it. So he goes over to the store, buys a symphony book of the Ninth Symphony, gets this time machine, travels back to early 19th century Vienna. Hey, Beethoven, this thing is really good. Just direct this as your last bow. Beethoven takes it. I look at the symphony I made. He directs it. It's great. Question, where did the symphony come from? Well, Joe got it from the store. Who got it from Vienna? Who got it from Beethoven? Who got it from Joe? No infinities involved. Everything's contingent, and the explanation doesn't make sense because we just haven't said where the symphony came from. Similar thing going on in the Euclid's thing. Yeah, okay, it goes backward infinitely, but that's not really essential. It's why it's a bad explanation. What's bad about it is you never said where Euclid's elements came from.
Interesting. Okay. There's that worry. I mean, there's also another worry where oftentimes there's like, you kind of made the slight rhetorical move where, we can't explain the collection of contingent things in terms of a contingent thing. Why then does it have to be in terms of a necessary thing? Why can't we have an explanation that doesn't cite the activity of a being? Maybe it's some sort of structural constraint. Maybe we appeal to some sort of metaphysical principles. Maybe we can have some sort of non-causal explanation that doesn't cite the activity of the contingent being, right? So we don't have a circuit explanation, but also doesn't cite a necessary being. Though we can grant that there's an explanation of all contingency, but why think that has to be in terms of the necessary being?
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting paper on this by Eddie Chen on the cosmic void, where he's thinking, in the paper, he's wondering, could we have a theory where there are no fundamental things, even though there are dependent things? And the answer he gives is yes, we could. If we have instead a fundamental law that says, let there be dependent things of the following such sorts. And he gets a little more into details in the physics because that's what he does. But you could have a similar thing going on in the contingency. So what if there's a fundamental law that says, let there be an atom, and that law could have been false, so the atom's contingent. Seems like you've got a contingent thing. You don't have a necessary thing because the law is not a thing. It's a part of the nomology, a different way of discharging a theoretical commitment. And that all seems fine. Like, that doesn't seem impossible.
Okay, so ranking. Of course, for the audience, we could go into these in so much more detail. We are alighting so much. We're alighting like thousands upon thousands of papers and books and whatnots, and objections and other things. So ranking, how do you rank contingency argument? Or contingency arguments as a family?
Contingency argument as a family, my inclination is a C. I'm going to bump it up to a B for their historical importance. I think that, if we're just going on the merits, it's a C or even a D. But because of the number of interesting philosophical questions and kind of interesting sub-literatures they spawn, that boosts it up to a B.
Interesting, yeah. For me, I take these on a case-by-case basis. For me, it's usually which contingency argument are we talking about? There are certain really interesting modal contingency arguments. There are certain non-modal ones. For some of them, I actually might give an A or maybe even higher because it's super duper interesting. For others, I'd give maybe a B, maybe a C minus. So let's just average that for now, and we'll say B or B plus.
Yeah.
So B plus, I'll do that for now. But again, for the audience, they know that I'm sympathetic to some versions of some kind of contingency argument. But sympathetic is different from not having any worries. So we have a similar sort of ranking there. Next up is Thomistic cosmological arguments from sustaining causation. Why are there? What explains the moment by moment existence of things? What explains why there's change? What explains why there are essence distance composites? There are all sorts of arguments here, but I'll just turn it over to you.
So the Thomistic contingency arguments have the same one thing in common. They all require a ton of Thomistic metaphysics. And the Thomistic metaphysics, I'll say controversial, but what I really mean is implausible.
Yeah, same here.
So we're now going into the details because I don't want to have to explain a bunch of scholastic jargon. I'm just going to say Thomistic contingency arguments, that's a D, maybe a D minus.
Right, and I don't like their focus on sustaining causation.
Mm-hmm.
Because my audience knows, I think there are very defensible views on which things can persist in existence without a continuously concurring sustaining cause would keep them in existence. I think we can have various different, this view is called existential inertia. Things persist without requiring that kind of continuous sustenance, just as things move through space without needing to be continually given an impetus to continually move. I think there are lots of different metaphysical accounts of existential inertia, that is, explanations of why things persist or why things exist at non-first moments of their existence, which don't cite the activity of an external sustaining cause operatives either at that moment or timelessly. So I just think there are lots of different explanations here. I don't see any pull towards demanding a sustaining cause. And that, of course, is in addition to lots of different background assumptions, rejecting lots of different background assumptions about the underlying metaphysic, like different ways of being and all these other sorts of things that I myself reject. So I'm not sure if I go, I'd probably go with like deep lens or something. That's okay. So we'll be short with that one. And then the last class of cosmological arguments here, we kind of want to cover Scotus's cosmological argument, or kind of Scotistic cosmological argument. So what is it?
Okay, so Duns Scotus's cosmological argument doesn't get talked about nearly as much as the kinds. Like, some of you might out there know that Duns Scotus had a cosmological argument on the general principle that every major scholastic had a cosmological argument. Of the scholastic cosmological arguments, Duns Scotus is definitely the most complicated, also the most beautiful. So he does this thing where he's like, here are three crowns. There's the first efficient cause, there's the first final cause, and there's the most excellent being. And then he gives this really elaborate argument that all three crowns have to be worn by the same being. And from there, you go to God. So again, I'm not going to get into the details because you can go knee-deep into Scotistic metaphysics, although I find Scotistic metaphysics less implausible than Thomistic metaphysics. Among other things, he got this really great distinction between an accidental infinite series and an essentially connected infinite series, where in accidental series, they'd be analogies like parents and children, that each element of the series gives birth to the next element, but is then sort of unnecessary for the element to continue doing its thing. So you have kids, your kids have kids, your kids' kids don't need you to reproduce. Whereas in essentially connected causal series, the activity of later things in the series depends on the activity of earlier things in the series. So the analogy here is like a power line. If the reactor shuts off, so does your light bulb. And unlike the other ones that have like brute anti-infinity stuff, Scotus is careful to make sure that his arguments only rely on essentially connected infinite series, in which case the need for a first is a lot more pressing. Whereas a lot of the infinite series that we think, you can have an infinite series going backwards, would be what he would call an accidentally connected series. But that's the kind of distinction that he uses that other scholastics didn't use, that make his argument sort of stand out. So I'm giving Scotus a B.
Awesome. Well, so Scotus, how does he relate in relation to Aquinas? Because didn't Aquinas also say like a per se infinite series and per accidens infinite series? Is that something similar?
He does. It's not the same as Scotus's.
Okay, I know that there are actually distinctions among there are different ways of catching out what it is to be a per se or essentially ordered series and what it is to be an accidentally ordered series. And I also know, different scholastics have cashed out in different terms. But maybe what your favorite way of cashing out is the way that Scotus does and the underlying metaphysics, his underlying metaphysics, are
they're much less elaborate. You don't need to get into the act potency stuff as much. You need to do sustaining causation. There are three crowns to work with, so they're you're already getting towards an excellent being as opposed to just like a first cause or a necessary being.
So that's enough for cosmological arguments, and maybe let's move on to ontological arguments. So we'll just cover two in this family. First up is Anselm's original Truslobian argument.
Yeah, so this is a really important distinction. People sort of run all the ontological arguments together, and there are a ton of families, some of which are manifestly bad with an E Descartes, others of which are interesting but probably don't work. That's where this argument's going to fall. And then others of which are sort of serious contenders in the literature. So the Anselm's original argument kind of relies on almost a Meinongian metaphysics, where if you can successfully predicate something, that thing exists, or that thing is, or it be's. The question is now, is it real or does it exist, depending on how we want to regiment exist. That argument is really interesting. There are a number of presentations out there that show that it's valid. There's one in Bob Adams's paper, The Logical Structure of Anselm's Arguments. There's a wholly non-modal one in David Lewis's Anselm and Actuality. There's a presentation in Brian Leftow's Anselm's Argument, Divine Necessity.
And that's really recent.
That's 2002. 2022.
Yeah.
That one. So the Leftow one is valid in pretty weak modal logics, KT, depending on the assumptions you make. The Lewis one is just using quantifiers. Now you quantify over understandability. So that it's Meinongian just like the other one, but no modal logic required. This one kind of gets lots of points for interesting, for persuasive, like I'm not Meinongian, I think.
I am not a Meinongian.
Almost definitely the Meinongian. So like very easy to resist and probably not very convincing. So I'm going to award it a C.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've always found one of Proust's criticisms of this kind of standard Anselmian ontological argument quite thing. And I think it's ultimately maybe getting at the Meinongian issue. But it's something like when we compare the greatness of beings, we're comparing how great they would be if they were to exist. And so when we're talking about the greatness of the greatest conceivable being, which only exists in my mind, the greatness of the greatest conceivable being that exists in reality and in the mind, we're just comparing the same greatness. It's the greatness of the being would have if it were to exist. Because you can't have greatness if you don't exist at all in the first place.
Right.
So if that's how we're understanding greatness, then Anselm, one of his premises is mistaken, that that in which none greater can be conceived would be greater if it existed in reality and in the understanding than if it just existed in the understanding.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately maybe this is getting at the Meinongian issue.
Right, exactly. Because like there's a premise that says there exists the greatest possible being as part of the argument that ends up proving that there's the greatest possible being. So one of two things is going on. Exists in two sense, and then it's an interesting argument that requires Meinongian metaphysics, or it's just a circle.
Right. So one of those two options basically. And I do not like Meinongianism. So why don't you like it? I mean, do you worry about how it's the various principles that motivate it would lead to positing like square circles and other sorts?
Yeah.
That's my big
right. It's basically just the Meinongianism, or the like, if I can predicate something of something, then there's a thing that satisfies my predicate.
Yeah.
Theirs being read in a very lightweight way.
Yeah. Okay. So we've done Anselm. You rated this one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How did you rank? C. Okay. Interesting. So I think because it has spawned so much distinct literature, it's like if the OG ontological argument, like, listen, I think in terms of convincingness, like it's not convincing to me at all in the slightest. It gets like an F probably. But in terms of like the impact that it's had, it's like maybe A tier, maybe even A plus, like bordering on S. This is something that Alex O'Connor or Cosmic Skeptic was bringing up when I had my discussion with him. I was trying to rank them in terms of their plausibility or their convincingness. And so I was like, we need to put Anselm super duper low. And he was like, no, but it's so legendary. Like, Joe, and I come around to that. Like, it's so legendary. So maybe I'd give it like, should I average F and A plus? No. I'll just say, I'll give it a B. I'll just give it a B because it's just so interesting and spawned such a literature. But next up is the modal ontological argument. So I just gave a talk about like 2 hours ago. I'll let you spell out. What are the modal ontological arguments?
So the really simple modal ontological argument says, necessarily, if there's a perfect being, then necessarily there's a perfect being. There could have been a perfect being, therefore there's a perfect being. Or necessarily there's a perfect being. You can kind of conclude as you want there. This argument is super fascinating. It also, like, I gave you the simplest possible version. There are any number of slightly more complicated versions, bit of advertising. There's one in particular that I favor. I want to point out that this argument also has its roots back in Anselm's writing. Really more in the reply to Bonello than in the proslogion itself. So he kind of gets credit as being the founder for both of these. This has intrigued a lot of people. Leibniz wrote on it. Russell is supposed to have been like walking across the lawn one day and just shouted out, the ontological argument is sound. It inspired Gödel's ontological argument, Hartshorne planning Norman Mount. So there's a ton on this. And it all gotten into super fascinating questions about metaphysics, about modality, about perfection. So this argument, it's not a bulldozer. We'll talk about when we do the arguments from atheism. There's sort of the parallel anti-ontological argument. And I don't know very many people. I think there are a few people who have been persuaded to use them by this argument, but not many. But in terms of quality of philosophical discussion, this one is off the charts. So this one I give it A plus.
So in that respect, I do also give it A plus, something like that, because just the immensely interesting literature that is spawned in metaphysics, modal logic, perfection, perfect being theology, all this sort of stuff, definitely off the charts there. In terms of convincingness, I think this might go down as my own the worst one in terms of. I think if you're just giving me this premise possibly God exists, God would be a necessary being if he exists at all, so it's possibly necessary that God exists, and then you use some fancy modal logic to get that God actually exists. Just in terms of that argument, I mean, we're going to get into the reverse modal ontological argument. It faces a symmetry problem where possibly God doesn't exist. And, if God were to exist, he'd be a necessary being. But possibly God doesn't exist, so he's not a necessary being, and so that doesn't exist. You get an exactly parallel argument, the same sort of premise which says that God would be a necessary being if he were to exist, and then the same premise which says possibly, or roughly the same equally plausible premise, possibly God exists, possibly God doesn't exist. Just in terms of these arguments alone, because there's absolutely no reason to prefer one or the other. And so it gives us no reason to accept the conclusion that God exists as opposed to the other conclusion that God doesn't exist. So just in terms of these arguments alone, I think convincingness wise, I'm like F tier. Like I'm immediately putting it F tier. But what they spawn is super interesting literature about how do we break the symmetry between these premises, that sort of thing. Or is there kind of some logical asymmetry such that, a certain kind of logic is needed for one argument, different logic is the other, and other sorts of things. That's why I'm inclined to agree with you that it'd be pretty high up. So I don't know how, I'm just, ranking these off the top of my head, but yeah, maybe this time I'll average. I'll average the convincingness as an F. And what you said, I give an A+. So what does that give us? Maybe C. But I'm just giving this a C.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's ontological arguments. And now let's get on to, let's do moral arguments.
Okay, let's do moral arguments.
So we got the kind of moral ontological argument, or the kind of view that God is needed for morality. So what is this argument and what do you think?
So this argument, and probably the most famous presentation, is the one in Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. It goes something like, look, there's this thing, objective morality, prove it by intuition, prove it by going around and taking a survey and finding that everybody checked murderers wrong on the survey box, like proven in a number of ways. That's like data for this argument. Then you sort of ask yourself, so how could there have been objective morality? And you think, well, morality is law-like. So maybe if there's this law-like thing, we have a lawgiver, and what kind of lawgiver could give this sort of law? It would have to be. Now, that's a very kind of rough and ready version of the argument. There are more sophisticated variants out there, but they all have sort of a structure. Objective morality is data that needs an explanation, and God is the best explanation for that data.
Why don't you I think you don't like these arguments. I despise these arguments.
So there's this entire tradition in ethics of trying to ground objective morality, and they haven't come up with nothing.
Right.
They may not have come to consensus, but there's a lot of ways out there to have objective morality. You don't even have to do either Verdelah's arguments against it. You just go read Kant and Mill and see if what they said is at least on the level of coherent.
Yes.
And you've got alternative ways to ground objective morality. So not only is this not a persuasive argument, persuasive this actually has been. So Mere Christianity is really popular. People found that argument really popular. This is an argument whose persuasive value kind of outstrips its philosophical and or rational value. Rationally, it's not compelling at all. Philosophically, it doesn't even raise that many new, interesting philosophical. How do I ground objective morality? You don't need to be puzzled about arguments for God to ask that question.
Yeah.
So, not a lot of interesting new literature has come out of this. I'm giving this one an F.
Okay, yeah, and in terms of contemporary people, just I don't know, we got a meta-ethics textbook or something, or something. Yeah. Just read get the Foundations of Morality or the Foundations of Ethics by Russ Schaefer Landau. I think he's the editor of it. And just, comb through it, and you'll be able to see so many different ways you can have objective morality without God's. Check out the work of John Bankson, Terence Cuneo, Russ Schaefer Landau, Michael Humer, David Enoch. I'm just listening to non-naturalists. I mean, if we can get into the net. Check out Peter Railton. Check out all these other sort of naturalists. The naturalists.
Read the Cornell realist.
Yeah, read the Cornell. On and on and on. So anyway, we don't need to go into that. I give it F+. F+. That's such a sad grade. I'm getting an S+,
right? I don't think we even have F+ at GMU.
Okay.
We've got A. We got plus and minus for everything else, including an A+ that all of 90 to 100.
Okay.
But F is just F.
Okay, I know. It's you did terribly, but it's we're just gonna it's a sympathy point.
Yeah, it's better than the Ray Comfort banana argument. We'll give it that.
That is true. It is better than the Ray Comfort banana argument. Okay, so but now on to a better moral argument. I think this is a better moral argument. Really interesting. The argument from moral knowledge, and it takes its cue from evolutionary debunking arguments. So how does this argument go?
Yeah, so let's go back to our objective morality. Thought you that. There are facts about what's right. How would we know those facts? And like knowing what we do about evolutionary biology, I start to get a little concerned about how we know these things because our cognitive system was optimized to survive and reproduce. Like that's what natural selection does. If you survive and reproduce, like the system locks in and you keep going. And if you don't survive and reproduce, you die. I like offhand, morality, survival, and reproduction don't really connect them in an obvious way. So there's this whole big literature. Sharon Street's kind of the originator, but then there's been a bunch of responses debunking objective morality on the basis of evolution. That might not be the only reason you'd be worried about objective morality. So you might think that, like, you know, if there are moral facts, they're these sort of super Platonic truths. And then you might be worried, like, how would we ever come to know such a thing? Like, how would our mind have causal contact with the moral? You could have sort of parallels to some of the naturalist arguments against mathematical Platonism from things like the causal theory of knowledge. So there are a number of reasons to get worried about objective morality. And particularly, even if you spot that there is such a thing, that we'd be able to come to know it reliably. In steps the theist. Well, I've got a being who's really interested in you guys knowing about objective morality and has the power to make it happen. So then you could do a kind of Bayesian argument, like, not only do we have objective morality, but we know, like, roughly its contours. I think there's some stuff we had to work on, but it took a long time to get over the slavery thing. So it's not like we had perfect knowledge all the way back, but our knowledge is at least doing pretty well. That's going to have to be part of the claim. And some of you were worried about, like, bad three parts. Like, what do you mean we're doing pretty well?
Kind of right.
We've clearly missed some big stuff in the past, and we're probably missing more big stuff now. But, you know, we know not to murder each other. We know not to steal each other's stuff. There's a bunch of basic things that we all need to.
Pain is bad. Pleasure is
Absolutely. And existence of a God at least somewhat predicts that, whereas it kind of looks like naturalism might not.
Yeah, and some people put it as, like, if naturalism is true, then we simply don't have any moral knowledge, because there are different ways you can put the defeater, but one is just like an explanatory condition on knowledge. So, like, you only know that P if somehow P figures in the explanation you're believing that.
Yeah.
Whereas under a kind of naturalistic picture where there's no God or anything like God guiding the process, are evaluative dispositions. So our dispositions to evaluate things in various ways, and our moral intuitions, which are ultimately arguably the basis of our moral beliefs. Those evolved for purely survival value, and the moral facts play no explanatory role whatsoever in their coming to be. And so if we need that kind of explanation as conditional knowledge, which is controversial, but if you need that kind of explanation as conditional knowledge, it may very well be the case that naturalism actually thoroughly undermines our moral beliefs. Like, we don't have any moral knowledge whatsoever under naturalism. So if we do have moral knowledge, as many people think we do, then naturalism is just going to straightforwardly be false. And maybe one thinks that the next best option is theism.
Exactly. So this argument does raise a lot of interesting philosophical questions. The questions about how, if you're a naturalist, you can explain moral knowledge. Questions about, like, how, if a theist, you explain moral ignorance. All these sorts of things that come up. I'm going to give this one a B. This one, like, I still don't think it's compelling. Like, I do think that there are ways to give naturalistic explanations of moral knowledge. But I do think there's something going for it.
Yeah, well, let's say you were a naturalist, like you're forced to defend naturalism. Would you go third factor? Would you say there is some sort of explanatory relation? Would you say we just don't need explanatory connection for not? That's what Gideon Rosen, for instance, does. He says we just, to hell with the explanation is conditions on knowledge. You know, we got math and all these other sorts of counter.
Right.
So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so, like, my basic outlook in epistemology is sort of knowledge first. Like, let's not try to define knowledge. That seems like a bad project. Let's identify the species of knowledge and then see what we can do with those. So I'm kind of sympathetic to this thought that, like, all right, we don't exactly know how we got the ability to learn moral truths, just like we don't exactly know how we got the ability to do, like, transfinite set theory, but hey, look, we're doing it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so lots of different approaches there. They're all very controversial, and I think, yeah, I mean, there's something to this argument. I can get myself in headspace to see the plausibility. Like, there's a lot of really interesting work by, mainstream meta-ethicists and philosophers working on evolution debunking arguments, and you can sometimes see the plausibility of those,
yeah.
And especially if you have this naturalistic picture. So
definitely,
yeah, I'm also going to give this like maybe even a B plus. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe a B plus. Could even be A minus. So bordering there, somewhere around there. Okay. Done with moral arguments. Let's move on to just broadly teleological style arguments. So maybe we'll start with like Paley, then fine tuning, then we'll go to harmonies. So let's start with Paley style arguments. What are these?
Yeah. So the old design arguments appealed to facts biology. And the thought was something like, look at these incredibly complex structures that you find in the natural world, whether that be like the eye or the immune system or what have you. It looks like any comparably complicated system that's like orderly and structured, as opposed to like a thunderstorm, which is complex but not orderly and structured. Anything that we recognize as having that level of complexity was designed by somebody with like vastly greater intelligence than the thing designed. You go look at a ship, and that was designed by a master ship. You go look at a robot, and that was designed by an excellent robot scientist or what have you. So, take the biological world, you need something way smarter than any sort of biological being to have designed those, and kind of hop, skip, and a jump to God.
All right, so you've explained these Paley-style design arguments. Why don't you like these?
So one key distinction to make here. So people often cast these as arguments from analogy. That's not how Paley wrote his thing. Paley wrote his thing as the explanatory argument. The kind of explanation we see for complex stuff tends to be intelligence. And that gives us reason to think that complex biological stuff is explained by intelligence. It's not just like a pure analogy, like the way some textbooks present it. Now, why do I think these arguments don't work? Well, in one word, Thomas. We found an alternative explanation for biological complexity that doesn't involve invoking a designer. Seems like a pretty adequate explanation, so kind of explanatory burden discharged without the need for theism.
Okay, and
For Darwin, this was probably a strong argument.
And then ranking.
So for historical significance and sort of philosophical interestingness, it gets some pluses. It's not very persuasive anymore. It's not rationally compelling anymore. Let's put it at C.
Yeah, C for me, maybe C minus. But I think C is fair. Yeah. Okay, next up is the fine-tuning argument. So what is this argument?
All right, so you can think of the fine-tuning argument as like the spiritual successor to the Paley-style design arguments. And so instead of focusing on biology, they focus on cosmology. Like, in a sense, sort of taking a page from Swinburne, who says, look, if we're going to do theistic explanatory arguments, we can't get Darwin again. We need to pick on things that are too big or too weird for the sciences to touch. And cosmological fine-tuning is sort of on the too big side of it. So what's cosmological fine-tuning? Well, it turns out there are these dimensionless parameters in the laws of physics, ratios between like masses of particles and things like that, or the cosmological constant. This is kind of like the poster child case. And it turns out if you make them just a little bit different, you improve the universe anymore. So like slightly change the cosmological constants. Not only no life, but like no stars. No stars, nothing interesting. Just hydrogen soup. Or like something that kind of expands and collapses right on itself, depending on which way you go.
Right.
So it looks like the laws of nature have to be very carefully calibrated in order to get big macro structures, life, stars, planets, etc. And that looks like the kind of thing that doesn't happen on its own, but that God would explain reasonably well. That's the thought behind the fine-tuning argument.
Awesome. So there's a big literature on the fine-tuning argument. Yeah. I'd like for us to discuss maybe 2 or so objections. Maybe 3. So one objection is appealing to the multiverse. So how does this objection go? And what do you think about it?
So here's like a really brute multiverse objection. Suppose instead of one universe with laws of nature that have to take various constants, we have a bunch of universes that all have the same structure in their laws of nature, but where all the constants get instantiated. Then trivially, some of them will have the life-friendly ones. Like most of them will be dense hydrogen soups, but a few of them will have interesting life in them. And since we're interesting life, we like to think we must be in one of those. Like that's roughly how multiverse responses to the fine-tuning argument go. I think this is a perfectly acceptable response.
Okay.
So the way I like to think of fine-tuning, think of physicalist atheism, single universe, as sort of like the king. And if you look at the history of philosophy through the last like 70 years, like that, if you ask people, what kind of world do you think we're in? your answer you're going to get most often is atheistic, physicalistic. There's only one of it. So that's like the dominant metaphysical outlook in analytic philosophy, going back to the origin of analytic philosophy. The king dies at the hands of the fine-tuning argument. Like, we have to give up atheism/physicalism or single universe. Now, if you only give one of those up, you can keep the other one. If you want a single universe, you can go theist, you can go axiarchist, you can go at a like the world mind, cosmic mind.
And cosmopsychist, yeah. Kind of the foundation of reality is like this, like cosmopsychist minds, the universe, the cosmos is like the cosmic consciousness, and it's sort of directed towards value in some way.
All of those are on the table. You can't rule those out with fine-tuning data. So it's sort of like the king dies and there's now going to be a scramble for power between these various somewhat marginal views. And there's still an atheistically flavored, the heir to the throne is still there.
I was about to say, what do you think? So, I mean, one objection that people often raise on the internet, at least a few objections people on the internet raise, which I don't like. One is like, oh, well, it's so speculative. There's no evidence for it. To which I say, the fine-tuning is the evidence for it. And of course, we could equally say there's no evidence for God. Well, the fine-tuning is like God predicts this, and non-theistic views apparently don't. So I think that's a confused response. And also, like, actually, at least some physicists have proposed multiverse models, which they argue, at least can in principle have evidence for them. And some in fact even argue that there isn't indeed evidence for a certain multiverse model. So that's another thing to say in response to that. Another one is like an appeal to simplicity. Like, this gets really difficult because there are a bunch of dimensions of simplicity. Right. Actually, plenitudinous views are arguably quite elegant and uniform. You think like all possible universes exist, or all sorts of things. So I'm not sure simplicity consideration. And the theist is positing this categorically new to each other's kind of reality, utterly unlike anything else. Whereas the multiverse is just positing more universes like what we already know exists. So it's very kind of qualitatively parsimonious, one might think. So I don't like parsimony objections to it. There are some other objections to it. Like, there's one where, is it Michael Rhoda who pushes it? Or maybe it's Mike Ray who pushes it. Or Rhea, I don't know how to. But it's like consider a theistic multiverse. It would seem to be populated with more of the universes would have life or value. So like
that's Rhoda.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think about that?
I think there's some merit to that. Okay. Yeah. So again, like, insofar as we've got life on somewhat plausible, although still controversial principles of like self-locating probability, that gives us evidence that there's lots of life. It's like shockingly hard to get rid of that inference, even though it seems like it kind of offers inference to make. There's me. There was an awful lot of me.
Right.
And there's this great code review paper by Johan Isaacs and John Hawthorne with a bunch of impossibility results showing like just how hard it is to purge that inference from your day-state probability theory.
This isn't fine-tuning, is it?
No. This is a different one. Like, fine-tuning is a good paper, and sort of lays out the fine-tuning argument in a way that I think is probably the best way to lay it out. No, this is a different paper.
Okay, nice. So also another objection, multiverse response, is the inverse Campbell's fallacy objection. It's like, our evidence isn't just that, some universe is life permitting. And the multiverse predicts that. But our evidence is that this universe specifically is life permitting. Right. And the multiverse, so the thought goes, the multiverse doesn't actually predict that this universe specifically would have life permitting constants. It only predicts that like some universe or other would have life permitting constants. And we need to work with our strongest formulation of evidence, the principle of total evidence.
Yep.
So what do you think about that inverse Campbell's fallacy charge?
So I don't think that works. And here's why. Yes, you maintain like a strong base factor with this universe as your evidence as opposed to some universe or other. But the higher probability that this universe exists is way lower.
Right.
So anything, and David Manley's data and argue that like anything you gain in the strength of the evidence, that's sort of what the base factor stands for, you just lose on the prior of this universe existing.
Or maybe God
creating this universe as opposed to some other.
I want this universe specifically to be defined in the one way, as opposed to any of the other infinitely many. This is that's something that
you make a much more implausible assumption and you keep your evidential strength, but you kind of lose You kind of wash out in the final assessment because everything you gained in the strength of the evidence, you lost in the improbability of the hypothesis.
You purchase predictive power by correspondingly decreasing your prime.
Exactly.
That's basically
what you do.
Okay, exactly. So that's the multiverse response to the fine-tuning argument. There are also some other responses. Like, what do you think about the response where it's like monotheism? Maybe it's also super duper surprising that the constants would fall within the narrow biological life permitting range, because I mean, like, God could achieve features of value like valence conscious states and relationships, even given universes that aren't life permitting. Now, he could just change the psychophysical laws. He could have electron through love. He could do all those sorts of things. He could miraculously sustain creatures, even though their physical conditions aren't life permitting. So it's also super duper surprising that God would do he would make the constants fall within the narrow life permitting range, because God could have gotten conscious creatures of value and relationships and whatnot under any of the range, basically, so long as he deals with those psychophysical laws.
So this is why I think it's a succession war rather than a coronation, because theism predicts the fine-tuning data better than like single universe atheism does, but it doesn't predict it so strongly that it like clears away all these other axiarchism, cosmic mind, multiverse atheism. I think that's right. That the theism's prediction of a universe of this type is not as good, partly just for specificity reasons, that those are less important, but also because God had options. Like, why would God want biologically embodied conscious material beings? As Marilyn Adams put it, God must have odd tastes.
Okay, so let's rank this one. I mean, I think a lot of internet atheists underestimate its force.
Yeah.
But I also think a lot of apologists overestimate its force, and they underestimate like multiverse responses and those sorts of things.
Yeah. So if you think of this argument as an argument for theism, I would give it an A. It's philosophically really interesting. It's got some rational force to it. It's got a decent amount of persuasive force. Like, this is kind of the grand champion of design arguments, and design arguments have traditionally been with some of the most popular arguments for theism. If you think of it as an argument against single universe atheism, then it's like S or S+.
Okay.
So like, think of it in the way that I prefer to think of it, and it's one of the best arguments in this literature.
Okay.
Think of it as like a way to establish theism. Like, it's still okay. It's still better than many of the others, but it's not this like all-consuming victory like it is against single universe atheism.
I'm sympathetic to that judgment that you say. I mean, yeah, maybe I'd give it A-, something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay. Next up in our teleological style arguments, sort of, are the harmony arguments. So, psychophysical harmony and nomological harmony. Let's take these in order. What's a psychophysical harmony?
So these are kind of like new kids on the block, which is a little bit rare in philosophy of religion. And it's not that some of the harmony-ish considerations don't come up a little bit in the Paddy. Leibniz's argument for rhetorical truth is sort of like you can see as a pretty big argument, but these are mostly new arguments, which is really cool. So psychophysical harmony, we'll start with a really simple puzzle. Like, why does pain hurt? You've got a physical property of pain that you can sort of describe functionally. It's this thing that you feel it when you're damaged, or when certain receptors go away. When your C fibers fire, to use the old philosophical term for what happens when you have pain. And then you have this phenomenal state of ouch.
Yeah, like what it's like to be in that state, the kind of felt experiential side of it, the mental side of it.
And it turns out they line up in this really beautiful way where C fibers firing, which is a response to damage or response to pain receptors,
and it causes avoidant behavior.
Right. It causes avoidance behavior. That's also really unpleasant. It goes with this hurty phenomenal state. Like, imagine if things got jibbered up a little and pain felt really good. Like,
yeah, or what by what you mean is, so I think some people in my audience might be thinking of pain as that phenomenal state,
right,
of hurtiness. So maybe what you mean is, imagine a world in which the C fiber, it's like the relevant physical functional basis of pain. Imagine what where that is associated with a very pleasurable experience, but it retains all its physical functional profile.
Right. Your C fibers fire when you're damaged, and it causes avoidance behavior. But it feels like you just took a lick of vanilla ice cream or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, can it think of the most pleasurable experience you've ever gone through? You get that every time somebody cuts your hand. Like, you still pull your hand away. But
the physical causes of avoidance behavior and the physical results of tissue damage are paired up with mental states in such a way that they rationalize avoiding, and they rationalize that sort of response. Whereas, in the inverted hedonic inversion situation that you described, we are actually systematically avoiding things which we have reason to pursue, like pleasurable experiences. We have reason to pursue those, and they're good to promote. Whereas we're systematically avoiding this, and instead we're systematically pursuing experiences that are excruciatingly bad, and things like a conceivable world.
Right.
And it also just more generally, it just seems conceivable that our mental state is just a jumbled mess. Like it's just pure static, like conscious experiences, although all the same physical functional facts remain the same. And so again, this weird sort of, our mental life is astonishingly orderly and also rationalizes behaviors in astonishingly harmonious ways.
Now, it's easiest to think yourself into these possibilities if you're a dualist, but the people who have made this argument have kind of gone to pains to show that at least certain kinds of physicalists also get these sorts of results. And so then, like, plug this into the Bayesian machine. If you've got a God who designed things, it sort of makes sense that we would be rationalized in pursuing good things like pleasure or like good feelings, not rationalized in pursuing the phenomenal ouchiness. And so, like, that makes good sense on theism and on naturalism, kind of like you hook these things up in random ways and pick something out of a bag.
Yeah, or maybe there's a bias toward like simpler psychophysical mappings where, you know, it's just all physical states are either mapped onto no consciousness, so everything would just be a T-zombie world, or maybe they're all just mapped onto like one state or something like that. Yeah. Like it's a very simple psychophysical mapping where I think you have this very rich concoctions.
Exactly.
How do you rate this argument?
So I think this argument's got some stuff to it. Like, it's raising really interesting questions, philosophy of mind, philosophy of perception. It's relatively new. So there's like some uncertainty bar about, you know, a devastating objection coming up in 3 years.
Yeah, or in the next decade or in 50 years.
A certain amount of faith in like the ability of physicalist philosophers of mind to come up with something here. So I'm going to sort of like tentatively give this argument a B, but saying that like it's got a lot of upside and not very much downside. So I could see this kind of, you know, as it gets explored further and as the contours of the atheist response become more clear, I could see this argument going up, but it would be hard to see it going down.
Interesting, yeah. So for the audience, I just released, you know, because we're recordings, I just released a video, an in-person interview with Dr. Brian Coder, one of the co-authors of the paper developing this new argument for theism. So definitely check out that discussion. We go into the argument in much greater detail therein. We talk about some objections. We can't cover all the objections and whatnot. There are many things that we didn't cover, but that was a fun conversation. So you give it a B.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. I don't have a fully settled view on this argument yet. Like you said, there's some plausibility to it. I still had some worries I raised with Brian and some that I didn't raise with Brian. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's fair, like B plus, B, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. And there is a bunch of, in my mind, this is something that I think a lot of people who jumped on this argument really quickly may not be considering. There's a lot of higher order uncertainty in my mind about like new arguments.
Yeah.
The history of philosophy is littered with failed arguments. So like the inductive evidence is like indicating this. Yeah, there may very well come like very serious objections.
Tell me you've got a philosophical argument for X, and without hearing the argument, I'm like 90-10 that it fails.
Exactly that, and also the fact that it's so new and that, so there's a lot of higher order uncertainty for me that like decreases any sort of confidence. I just want to wait till the literature kind of catches up.
Yeah, this argument is like, okay, this is a cool idea. Let's see what happens to it over the next decade.
Yeah, and like you can see there's like a degree of plausibility to it. At least I see that there's a degree of plausibility to it. Like we're not talking like moral argument level. Like this is not, we're not there. You got 3 more arguments for theism, and then maybe we'll just do like some problem people, and then we'll just close it. Okay. So next up for the teleological style argument, and it's the last, is nomological harmony argument. And actually, I just had Brian also talk about that. Basically, for the audience, it's something along the lines of, there are various laws that apply to the world. And we can imagine different laws which fail to apply to the initial state of the universe so as to evolve it forward in an interesting way. Like we can imagine that, you know, instead of, you know, I know Brian gives this analogy of, there's like a rule book, and then there are the chess pieces, or like the various pieces of the game. And we can imagine that there are different rule books, but it goes with different chess pieces that doesn't describe anything. So it's like, you know, A's interact with B's to evolve forward the universe in such and such a way. But lo and behold, you look at the concrete world and there are only C's and D's. So like the universe is stillborn, as it were. So we can then, arguably, it seems like there are different pairings of laws and initial conditions of the universe, which don't evolve the universe forward in very interesting ways. And it seems kind of surprising that we got a pairing there, which evolves the universe forward in interesting ways. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah. So like, do you have a really simple example of how this might work? Let's say we've got our trusty old F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. But then all the particles in the universe don't have mass. They have this other thing called schmass. That has some mass-like dispositions, but it's not the same thing. So the law doesn't tell us anything about forces because we've got acceleration, but we don't have mass. And so that equation always comes out undefined. That's the sort of nomological disharmony situation. And once you see how to deal with one law, just kind of like, okay, so I take the things this law mentions, and then I make the things in the universe, not those.
Yeah.
And then we just kind of have this disconnect where we have laws that govern nothing and things that are ungoverned.
And the thought is like, at least, it seems like in some intuitive sense of more, I mean, can define up measures, which would make it very, very difficult. But
yeah,
in some intuitive sense of more, they're like more disharmonious pairings between initial conditions and dynamical laws.
Right.
Laws which
most of the laws, don't mention most of the things, and most of the things aren't covered by most of the laws.
Yeah, exactly. And so then we get this question, why are they paired in ways that evolve the universe forward in interesting ways under a kind of naturalistic picture where the foundation of reality is kind of indifferent things of value? Seems like there isn't really any bias towards harmonious pairings that evolve the universe forward in interesting ways. Whereas under a kind of some sort of value selection hypothesis, foundation of reality is directed in some sense towards producing things of value. It's not as surprising. So we've evident her value.
If the same fellow that made the things wrote the laws, then it's no accident that the laws talk about the things.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's an interesting way to put it. What do you think about this argument?
So again, this is a very new argument. So there's some uncertainty by for newness. This, to my view, this is not as strong as the psychophysical harmony.
That's also my view.
Yeah. Why is that? Because there's a kind of a big old option for the atheist to take about laws of nature that would negate the argument. I'm talking here about the Lewis-Ramsey-Mill theory of laws.
Yeah, the best systems account.
So this says that here's what a law is. It's a universal generalization that's part of the best system for axiomatizing all the categorical particular matters of fact that make up the universe, the Humean mosaic.
It's the distribution of like fundamental qualitative properties at each point in space.
Yeah, exactly. And if you've got that theory of laws, then it's totally not an accident that the laws are about the things. To define the laws, we describe the thing.
So this view of laws doesn't have kind of spooky governing picture where laws kind of push and pull things around. They govern things. Instead, they're just mere descriptions of the space-time mosaic. They're descriptions which figure in the best kind of system or the best
exactly.
System. And then it's no surprise that the laws apply to the things, basically.
So I think A, Humeanism is the best theory of laws, kind of to core. But B, I think if you're a naturalist, really Humeanism is the best theory of laws, because the other good theories of laws kind of are much more plausible on theism. Like if you're a theist, you can sort of see why there'd be governing laws or decretalist laws or whatever.
Yeah, what do you have powers?
So I don't like powers. I think they're spooky. And like, it's the part of me that has some inclination towards physicalism that really is driving that feeling. So like, if I were a full-on physicalist, which if I were a theist, I would be like a reductive physicalist. Like, that really rejects powers. So as a theist, I reject powers because I don't think I need them.
Okay.
If I put on my physicalist hat, I reject powers because they're spooky.
And they might not figure, they don't seem to figure in at least microfigure.
Exactly.
So at least that's something that Dr. Daniel Linford, one of my co-authors from our Springer book, he argues that in some unpublished papers of currently under review. So I should mention more. But he defends kind of microphysical and the absence of causation at the microphysical level, and he thinks this meshes well with naturalism, etc. Anyway, so that's interesting that you're kind of human about law. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, David Lewis is kind of my philosophical hero.
Right. No, whenever I ask, who's your favorite philosopher? I'm like, well, do you mean contemporary or historical? Well, I mean, historical. I mean, what am I going to say? Socrates, maybe? And that's probably because he embodies the philosophical spirit. He questions everything. He's dedicated to living a good life, virtuous life. But when they ask about contemporary, I'm always like David Lewis. I mean, amazing writer, even though he got, in my view, at least a lot of things mistake. I love these rock, but like the way that he argues for him is this rigorousness, the clarity, the ingenuity. Yeah, absolutely. I say David Lewis is my favorite philosopher, contemporarily speaking. So,
and like, we're not unique. If you go after one full of analytic philosophers with their favorite philosopher.
I would think analytic metaphysicians.
The ones who aren't saying out the planet or something like that are going to say David Lewis.
Yeah. Okay.
Or get fine.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So. Did we rank this one, the nomological harmony?
Nomological, I'm going to give it, let's give it a C.
Okay.
Like the philosophical issues are kind of interesting, but only under specific theories of laws of nature. And like, I think there's, going to humanism is a really easy way out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I do have some antecedent antipathy towards humanism. I am somewhat sympathetic to Power's use of laws.
Yeah.
And there is a kind of, you might think, well, then it's no surprise if laws are just descriptions of the causal powers of things, that laws apply to things because they're just descriptions of the things as powers. But as Brian Cutter points out with Brad Son, there is a revenge kind of problem for that sort of view where why the powers link up in kind of harmonious ways.
Exactly.
So there is that. So maybe I'll give it a B-.
Yeah.
Because I'm more sympathetic to views of laws which might face this difficulty.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about this argument. Like, the more non-human you are about laws, the more worried you should be about nomological harmony. The more human you are about laws, the less worried you should be about laws.
I think also, and also like, like as you said, that's a perfect way to put it. Because like the more non-human you are, like I think the power series, it's non-human, but it's like still kind of close. Laws are just descriptions. It's like the concrete things that are doing that.
Yeah,
but you get to like primitivism, where boundaries like super spooky entities, they move things around. Yep, I think that view, right, you should be. Yeah, I genuinely.
Come on, Tim Maudlin.
I genuinely think those views, like this argument, is very powerful. For theism, if you have those, I just antecedently so oppose that kind of primitivism. I just think.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so we just got through nomological harmony, and that brings us to only two more arguments.
All right.
Miracles and religious experience. So, what do you think about the argument for miracles?
I don't really find it plausible that there are miracles unless God's already, you already conditionalized on theism.
Right.
So, as an argument for theism, I think you would consider ordinary.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. Yeah, so I guess your thought is just the prior, maybe this is a way to put it, just the prior probability of some event that you hear testimony about being actually miraculously caused by God or something like that. If you're not already theist, the prior probability of that is just going to be so overwhelmingly low.
Exactly.
You're just going to favor the disjunction of the even somewhat implausible naturalistic hypothesis.
Exactly.
Like, okay, someone lied. Okay, someone misperceived something. Okay, maybe someone mistook
a lie or a mistake or a mass hallucination. All of these phenomena that are, okay, maybe they're not the best explanation, but you'd like to have a better one. But their disjunction is going to be more plausible than theism if you don't already have a pretty high credence in the existence of God.
Yeah, and not just theism, but also God doing something that he seems to have a strong inclination not to do. So even under theism, I tend to think that even miracle extremely probable. It's that's your last resort for a hypothesis, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, to me, it's like kind of well, maybe aliens did it or something. Maybe a ghost caused it.
Right.
The disjunction of naturalistic explanation. Let's see something more about even if each of the individual naturalistic explanations has a bunch of problems and it's individually implausible, again, the disjunction, I just think it's going to be more powerful.
I more plausible.
Okay, so I don't think I'd go as low as that, but maybe D+, something like that. So anyway. Okay, and then argument for religious experience. What do you think about this?
So I think this one is more interesting. And in particular, I think the attempts to model religious experience as a kind of perception, which you've got current work being done on that at Rutgers. There's this great book by Carolyn Franks Davis.
We read that in our Paul Draper class.
Yes, at Purdue.
So there's then William Alston was sort of ahead of the ball on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
The idea that you could potentially so first of all, the form of the argument is great. How do I know there's an F? Well, I saw it. Okay. That's a pretty good reason to believe that there's an F.
Yes, exactly.
So as long as mystical perception makes sense as a category of perception, and some uncertainty bars go around that, then this looks like a fine argument. It's a persuasive argument. Lots of people end up converting after they have these experiences. Even very sophisticated philosophers like Bas van Drossen converted after having a mystical experience.
Didn't he convert to Catholicism?
He did.
Yes. After
in Rome, sat in a church for a day.
After being, and still I think continue being a very hardcore kind of empiricist,
constructive empiricist,
constructive empiricist,
doesn't believe in electrons.
Doesn't believe in electrons, extremely anti-metaphysical.
Which is not the sect of Christianity you choose if you're going to be anti-metaphysical. You'll be a Unitarian Universalist if that's your. But nope, he ended up a Catholic.
Right, exactly.
So it's persuasive to many people. If you have the mystical experience, it's pretty rationally compelling to you. So when you don't have the experience, then again, you've got to put there are other potential explanations.
Your temporal lobe is just firing a little bit too much today.
So like the testimony of religious experience, not as strong an argument as like the experience itself. I'm going to give this one an A because it also raises a ton of cool philosophical questions about the nature of perception and the nature of the mystical.
Yeah, interesting. So what do you think about like the objection from just a disagreement? I mean, there's a distinction between your experiences, which the content of which are incompatible. And then there are also, I mean, we've just should distinguish that from like the interpretation that people impose on it and the various commitments that they derive from it and those being incompatible. But we might still think that like the experiences themselves, at least a lot of testimonial reports seem to be conflicting in various ways. Like some people experience seem like a personal reality, others an impersonal fundamental reality. Some it's just very different. And so some people might have a experience like a Hindu god or like Vishnu or Krishna or something, and other people experience Jesus. As an outsider, someone who I seem to be maybe like religiously defective with my, I don't have any religious experiences at all, even growing up in attending these services or people doing this, nothing sticks. So what am I to make of this as an outsider with all this disagreement?
Yeah, so I think if you haven't had a religious experience, like the argument from the testimony of others about religion, like that may be more key-ish.
Mm-hmm.
It's the experience itself that makes the good argument, I think, in this case.
Okay.
And so how should everyone who hasn't had religious experiences make sense of people running around saying they have them? Well, you can think that there are a handful, like it's probably a handful of different naturalistic phenomena that happen.
Right.
Weird stuff in the brain, where's the temporal lobe, mind and body do odd stuff. Like there's some amount of that out there. I think we shouldn't take people too seriously when they try to explain the content of their experience, because like given theism, God is super weird. And so people attempting to conceptualize this thing are probably going to use inadequate and inaccurate language. And from that, you can get all sorts of contradictions and inconsistencies.
Yeah. Okay. So you gave sort of different rankings depending on whether you've had a religious experience. Okay. So it's like, if you think
A plus, maybe even at, you had a religious experience.
It's certainly S for best and Franklin or whatever.
Exactly. Right. And if you're just hearing about other people's religions, then it's more like a C or a B.
Yeah. And see, I'd be inclined maybe like, C minus or something like that. Something.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's all the theistic arguments that we're going to be covering. Maybe we'll just get into one or two atheistic arguments because we do have to attend further talks.
Right.
So one or two atheistic arguments. Let's start with the problem of evil. And there are deductive and Bayesian versions. Let's just take them both together. So how about you explain both deductive and Bayesian versions and then rank them?
So a Bayesian version of the argument for evil would go something like this. Given theism, we expect a particular way for the goods and evils of the world to be distributed, like in a sort of orderly way, where like it happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Or maybe even good things happen to everybody if you've got a less indicative form of theism. What we actually see is just like a big jumbled mess. Good things happen kind of randomly, bad things happen kind of randomly. Not what you'd expect on theism. That is kind of what you'd expect if there's like no governance to the universe whatsoever, or what Draper calls the hypothesis of indifference. And so the Bayesian version of the argument says, when you see this pattern of goods and evils in the world, that confirms the indifference hypothesis over the God hypothesis. A deductive version of the argument, like the really strong version, says something like, look, if you've got a God, then that God has the power to eliminate evil and the knowledge to eliminate evil and the will to eliminate evil, so there shouldn't be any evil. But hey, look, so no God. Like that's like you can give different deductive casts. So like recently Jim Sturba give it a different try with a much weaker argument. By weaker, I mean like logic, or less demanding premise.
Yeah.
The argument itself is a better argument.
You don't have to commit to as much. And usually the weaker the argument, the stronger the argument. By which I mean, the weaker the premises, the less they have to commit you to, the less you have to take on and be committed to these various, very controversial things that have more and more arguments against your view, the better the argument. So it's a stronger argument in that sense with weaker premises.
So in one sense, I think the argument from evil is the best in the atheist stable. I don't think it gives rationally compelling reasons to abandon your theism. I do think like nobody's theism survives contact with this argument unscathed. Like at some point, like whatever you thought kind of growing up or early on as a theist, you sort of kind of make a real existential contact with the problem of evil. and your theism changes in somewhat unpredictable ways when you finally do that.
Right. Are you thinking like either towards maybe universalism, or maybe you think God doesn't have any obligation?
Exactly.
You have to take on some sort of...
Right. You end up thinking something that, like, if you went and tried to teach Sunday school, they'd chase you out of the church.
Interesting.
So that makes it a very good argument, even though it's not like a silver bullet against theism type of thing. The way that like fine-tuning is a silver bullet against single universe atheism. We'll give it an A+.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be less inclined towards deductive arguments for various reasons.
The deductive ones are almost always bad.
I mean, just in general in philosophy, and in philosophy religion specifically, the training of deductive arguments can often be unproductive. And
which is interesting, because as Joe can tell you, I just gave a talk yesterday about why the Bayesian arguments of philosophy of religion are almost all bad as well.
It's given certain stuff. Just But yeah, no, that was a very interesting and disturbing talk. I still like that about it. Yeah, so I mean, the deductive versions I'm less inclined towards. I mean, maybe I'd give like B-, C+, something.
I would give the deductive version. I would put them like in the D- tier.
Okay.
Maybe not all the way to F. Like, they're not as bad as the banana argument.
I mean, they're not like moral argument level. Like,
right. Well, Mackey's is, but
okay. Well,
this is.
That's true. That's true. As for Bayesian versions, I notwithstanding your criticisms of Bayesian arguments in general, which cuts across a lot of people in religion land, that maybe there aren't many good arguments for or against God's existence. Notwithstanding that, I'm quite sympathetic. I'm very sympathetic, in fact, to a number of Bayesian arguments of evil, to the point that I'd put like probably A+ here, maybe even S.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. So yeah, that's probably my take on those. Maybe one more. Hiddenness, the hiddenness argument. Let's just briefly cover hiddenness, and then we'll conclude.
So there's one thought that like hiddenness is just a kind of problem of evil. For a long time, I thought that, and then Jeff Russell and Charity Anderson kind of convinced me that, okay, there's an autonomous argument here.
Is that in one of their papers?
Yeah, that was their Sanders Prize winning paper.
Oh, nice. Okay.
So again, there's like the deductive version, which like rule of thumb, those are not good. And there's the Bayesian version, like modulo my criticisms of that, usually better. Neither, I think, is particularly compelling. More compelling if you're trying to argue against like Christianity or Islam. Where you're not only a theist, but like a providential theist and have got particular characters to the God you're interested in. It's stronger in those contexts. In the context of like kind of generalized theism, it's less strong. Hiddenness, the deductive version is going to be down in the D range again. The Bayesian versions, we'll give it a B.
If I put probably one S, then I'd probably give like the Bayesian versions of the hiddenness maybe like A-, maybe B+, something like that. If I put Bayesian versus the problem of evil in like A+, then maybe I'm moving hiddenness, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, your philosophy, I think certain versions of religious views which require as a condition of being saved and avoiding hell, explicit doxastic commitment to certain doctrines in the religion. I think hiddenness a close to devastating problem.
Yeah, hiddenness becomes a really hard problem if that's your theism.
I think it's close to devastating. I mean, as always, there aren't fully ever devastating problems in philosophy, but I think it's one of the closest I myself can come to devastating in my own mind to those versions.
Sure.
And those are very popular versions among people.
Most American evangelicals, most American Catholics, that's where you find them.
Right, exactly. And but notably, Catholicism doesn't actually require the condition at salvation that you have an explicit doxastic commitment prior to your death. So
this is like lay belief, not dogma.
Yeah, lay belief. Yeah, exactly. So like, maybe even most Christians, probably most Christians. So it's a powerful argument in that sense. And in that way, it can be quite convincing. I mean, I think like many people are troubled by the kind of hiddenness of God and how that interacts with salvation.
There's a reason the theologians named it the Deus Absconditus.
Right. Who's this? Exactly.
I think we'll raise one more.
Okay, let's do one more.
One more, and I'll just say were I to become an atheist, this is probably the argument that would do it.
Okay.
This is the argument from like superfluity of the divine.
Okay.
That, supposedly get a final physics that explains everything that needs explaining. That would be a pretty good reason to think that there's not a God, I think. So that, like, somewhat underrated. I think theists kind of underrate how strong this argument could be. I'd put it in, like, the B+ to A- tier.
So you're thinking like basically something similar to what Oppie does. He has this book, Best Argument Against God, where he basically argues that he develops, he like really fleshes out a naturalistic worldview. He like fleshes it out, gives a bunch of different like commitments that he has. He also fleshes out a theistic worldview, gives a bunch of different commitments that they have. And he basically goes through various pieces of data and says, we're like roughly on an exploratory par with respect to these data.
Right.
But my theory is simpler than yours in various respects. And so there's a sort of decisive advantage in favor of my theory as opposed to yours. And so, we should either accept my theory or at least we should reject theism. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly.
Okay.
The thought is something like, if there's a God, it should make a difference metaphysically somehow.
Yeah.
And if it turns out we're unable to locate that difference once we've figured out most of the things we need figuring out, I think that would be a pretty devastating case.
Okay, interesting.
We're a long ways away from that happening, but...
Yeah. Well, okay, now that we have a little bit more time.
Yeah.
How about the no best world argument? What do you think about this? Rose, the kind of improvability argument.
So this one was really cool because, again, it was a new argument. In mid-90s, I would have said like the same sort of stuff I was saying about the harmony arguments. Now I think it's been decisively refuted.
Okay.
So, I think Dean Zimmerman gave a great response in the volume on Peter van Inwagen, sort of showing that the quality of the product doesn't always redound to the character of the producer. I think that I think I gave a pretty good argument in my God Meets Satan's Apple paper that refutes this one. So I think this one, like, it was a cool idea, but put a fork in it, it's done. It does raise cool philosophical issues. So I'm going to put it in the C bracket. It's like unconvincing, uncompelling, cool philosophy.
Okay. Well, with that, we are going to close. Any parting words to the audience from Dr. Daniel Rubio?
Yeah, like if you study arguments for the existence of God, just to swap points for your team, like you're making a mistake. Because most of what's cool about these arguments are the various philosophical issues they raise and the opportunity to think through these tough questions. Like at the end of the day, like as we saw in this list, there's not going to be a silver bullet for team A or team B. So to me, it's kind of like less compelling to study these arguments because I'm going to go out and convince the atheists to come to my side, and they're going to go out and convince me over to their side. But they do lead to a lot of really fun and fruitful conversations, and for that reason, are worth thinking more about.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Daniel, for coming on. As you guys know, check out the description. As I said, I've linked a lot of Daniel's stuff in the description. I've also linked other resources to stuff compiling arguments for and against God's existence if you want to look deeper into some of these things. Some of the papers that we mentioned, all of them put down there and whatnot. And then what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmidt. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.